In conversation with Robert W. Norris. Robert W. Norris was born and raised in Humboldt County, California. He was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War and served time in a military prison for refusing his order to fight. In his 20s, he roamed across the United States, went to Europe twice, and made one journey around the world. 1983, he landed in Japan, where he became a professor at a private university and retired as a professor emeritus. He is the author of three novels, a novella, a memoir, and over 20 research papers on teaching. He and his wife live near Fukuoka, Japan. And on today's episode of Author Interview, it's my utmost pleasure and joy to have on the show today Robert W. Norris. How are you doing, Robert?
Doing just fine, Peter. How about you?
I'm doing very fine too. It's lovely. It's a fine, good morning here in Nigeria. It's quite lovely to have you on the show today.
Yeah, it's in the evening here, and it's been a hot day. But once the sun goes down, it cools off a little, so it's a little bit more comfortable.
Interesting. That's quite amazing. So lovely, actually. We're gonna be delving into your book. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Robert, I want to first say that, reading the description page of your book, The Good Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise, Sentimental Memories of Mom and Me on Amazon sounds quite interesting, captivating, and compelling to me. I particularly love the subtitle, An Expatriate Son's Intimate Memoir and Tribute to His Mother. I'd love to ask you, could you tell us about the making of this book? What inspired you to write The Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise?
About 3.5 years ago, my mother passed away, and she was just short of her 95th birthday. So she
Oh,
lived a good, long, and fulfilling life, but she also had to deal with a lot of adversity in her life, and
mm,
she and her family during the 1930s. She was born in 1926, I think, but they had to deal with the depression and losing all their money and jobs and everything. They were farmers basically in the middle part of America in North Dakota. And I don't know if you're familiar with the classic American novel by John Steinbeck called The Grapes of Wrath. It's a pretty famous story about a family from Oklahoma dealing with poverty and having to migrate to Southern California during the Depression and looking for work. And anyway, my mom's family was somewhat similar to that family, and they uh, managed to make it from the Dakotas, North Dakota, to
mm,
Oregon and Washington, and they were doing whatever work they could find along the way, picking fruit during the different season or doing different labor jobs and camping out. But they finally settled in Oregon, and that's where she grew up. Or not Oregon, actually on the Washington side of the Columbia River, which is the
wow.
border between the two states. And she had quite an interesting and adventurous period of growing up in the 1930s. She was very independent and
Mm,
very strong-willed, very athletic, and worked very hard to help contribute to her family. And she got married quite young, and she married a World War II hero. And
wow.
she probably got married a little bit too young, but I came along in 1951, and I had a brother and a sister, and
Oh,
somehow maybe she was a bit too much of a feminist at that time, and
oh,
strong-willed and a bit stubborn. But the marriage didn't work out, and she ended up divorcing and got married about a year later. Well, eventually, she became a pilot. She got her pilot's license, and she flew a couple of years for the Forestry Service as a fire spotter, looking out for smoke or fires in the forest areas of the Sierra Mountains in Eastern California near Reno, Nevada. And then later on, she became a legal secretary. She took night classes in her 50s and she became qualified. And she ended up working until she was about 78 years old. Well, she was always very supportive of me, and I grew up during the 1960s, a very tumultuous time in the Vietnam War. And as you mentioned in the intro, I was a conscientious objector from within the military, actually. My job, thinking that I could avoid the draft, conscription, and perhaps it would be an alternative to having to be sent directly to Vietnam and fight in a war that I didn't really think was right. At the age of 18, most of us young men we had to sign up for the draft, and many of us were drafted and sent to Vietnam during that generation. Well, an alternative to that was maybe joining the Air Force or the Navy. And the odds of being sent directly to the front lines in Vietnam were somewhat reduced. But as it turned out, I got put in the only career field in the Air Force that was combat trained, and my job became guarding the B-52 bombers that were dropping tons of napalm and Agent Orange and explosives on the jungles of North Vietnam. And this was around 1970. My order to Vietnam actually came, and it was shortly after what was called the Kent State shootings, where there were riots all across the United States in American college campuses, protests against the president at the time, Richard Nixon, had been promising the American public that he was going to wind down the war and withdraw our troops. But in secret, he invaded the neighboring country, Cambodia, which was providing a kind of pipeline for materials for the Viet Cong to ship munitions and food and whatnot secretly under the canopy of the jungle. And Nixon didn't tell the American public what was going on. And when he announced it 2 or 3 days later, there were just eruptions all over the country. And at one state university in Ohio, Kent State, the National Guard was called in to put down a demonstration there that had gotten out of hand. And they ended up shooting 4 students and killing 4 students. Actually, about 10 others were injured too. And just the whole nation was splitting apart. And at that time, I was actually being trained, as were many other young soldiers who were guarding the B-52 bombers, the air police in the Air Force, on how to put down a demonstration in case a lot of college students and young anti-war people came to the base where we were stationed. This was in Northern California. And at that time, after Kent State, that was like the last straw for me. And I realized that if I really had to point a gun at my own countrymen and possibly be ordered to shoot at them, that I would throw my gun down and join the other side. And so I applied for conscientious objector status, but I wasn't real confident of that because I didn't have a strong religious background. And eventually I was court-martialed and had to spend some time in a military prison. And throughout all this, my mother was very, very supportive. And there were others in my age group who were maybe not as supportive, or even friends or acquaintances who were not supportive. But my mother had never left my side. And so she, through everything, had a tremendous influence on me. And later on in my 20s, when I returned to society, I was kind of searching for identity, and I bummed around the United States working labor jobs and ended up going to Europe a couple of times, bumming around Europe, hitchhiking and camping out and meeting a lot of young poets and musicians and artists, and was really envious of them because they could all speak 3 or 4 different languages, these young Europeans. And I was embarrassed because I could only speak my own native English and not very well at that. And so, uh, under their influence, when my money ran out and I returned to the States, I now had a kind of direction in life. I wanted to become a writer. And 4 years later, I returned to Paris, and under the influence of writers such as Hemingway, I thought, well, I'd like to be an expatriate writer and write about my experiences. And I ended up meeting a young man from Afghanistan and another man from Iran. And they were having some trouble trying to give a message to this front desk clerk at this cheap French motel that we were staying in. And I'd picked up a little bit of French by then, so I was able to give a crude translation of their message, and the desk clerk understood. They were so overjoyed, they invited me to come back with them to their countries. And I thought, well, that would be an adventure, and my money's running out quite quickly in Paris as the cost of living was high there. And this was actually before the Islamic Revolution of 1979. This was 1977. So the Shah was still in power in Iran, and there were quite a few American oil companies that were set up there. And so there was the possibility that I could find a job teaching English or something. So that started about a 10-month journey around the world. And I never did find the job, but had a lot of incredible adventures. But when I came back to the States, I had a kind of serious case of reverse culture shock. And so the first place I stayed was with my mother and her second husband. And again, nothing but love and support from her the whole time. And another 4 years passed, and I ended up, well, during that time, my dream was to live and work and study in a foreign country. And that dream came true in Japan. I ended up here in 1983. And through the years, my mother visited here maybe 8 or 9 times. And so we always stayed in touch. We always kept in touch by letter. She was a prolific letter writer. Later on, when the internet came around, we started sending emails back and forth. She actually started studying Japanese, when she was in her 60s. And so we both had a pretty adventuresome life. And when she died, reflecting back on everything, I was about 70 years old at the time. So at that age, you start reflecting back instead of looking forward a lot. And so I just thought, well, I'd like to write my own story, but I'd also like to write my mother's story. And so I combined the two into kind of a combination hybrid biography memoir. And it's like two books in one. So that's a long answer to a short question. Sorry to take up so much time.
Yeah, I enjoyed listening to it. That's such a long and amazing story, detailing how you came about your book. And I like hearing you talk about the story of your mom and your travels and yourself all together in a single book. Sounds quite amazing to me, really. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely. So, Robert, you also have another book in the name of Looking for the Summer, which is a former Vietnam War conscientious objectors adventures and search for identity in Europe, which I think you mentioned stylishly in your answer over there. To your adventure in Europe, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and India in 1977. What I first love to say, that's such a bunch of countries, really. And I'd like you to tell us
Yeah.
a bit about it.
Okay. Yeah. That story I wrote. Well, actually, that was maybe the first book that I started writing back in my 20s after I came back from the round the world trip, but I just wrote a rough draft, and I was very dissatisfied with how it turned out. I was still very much at the amateur stage of my
Mm.
writing career and really didn't have any control. It was just kind of like writing a journal. I was putting down everything that I'd experienced on the road, especially with that Iranian and Afghan and my experiences in Turkey and Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. But as years went by, and once I got to Japan
Mm.
and I managed to get a little bit more of a stable job, I started studying in addition to Japanese, in order to get a more stable job in Japan. I was working as an English conversation teacher,
Mm.
and this was the 1980s. Japan's economy was booming at the time, and
Yeah.
there was a great need for engineers who were going overseas to work in factories, here and there around the world. They needed English to do their jobs, so it was fairly easy to find piecemeal work like that. But once I got married a Japanese woman, I committed myself to living here full time. I needed a more stable job, and the only possibility I thought was to be a full-time teacher at a university, but I needed a master's degree to do that.
Yeah.
And so I found a correspondence course, and it took about 7 years of working here and there and
Oh,
studying. But I finally got the master's degree, and
interesting.
about the same time, I was able to get a full-time job at a Japanese university. So I
Oh,
think the discipline of the academic type of research and writing is what I really needed to refine my writing skills and
wow.
learn about pace and grammar and voice and all these different things that are
Yeah.
necessary to tell a story.
Yeah.
So I took out that old manuscript and I looked at it again, maybe, this was the 1990s by now, so 20 years later or something like that. And so I completely rewrote it about 3 or 4 times and I turned it into
Oh,
a novel, kind of autobiographical, but highly dramatized here and there. And so it tells the story of a young ex military conscientious objector who's gone to prison and is on a search for identity and traveling through the East,
mm.
basically. And the focus of the story is about the relationship with his father and remembering his father who has died by now, but his father was a World War II hero from used to be a pilot who flew with the invasion in Normandy and flew about 70 combat missions over Germany and
Mm.
somehow survived. And so the conflict between the father and the son is kind of an ageless story in that sense.
Oh,
But uh, he goes through a kind of war zone himself as a kind of means to prove himself to his dead father, I suppose you could say. And
mm.
in the end, he decides to return home and visit his father's grave and apologize for everything. And
Wow.
so I think it's a coming of age story of a young man and dealing with not only the decisions that he's made, the moral issues that he faced, but also uh, family issues. And so that was the first novel, and it did okay. It was published by a small independent publisher that I found here in
Oh,
Japan.
interesting.
And yeah, very
That's
different.
lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an amazing one, actually. I love, hearing about that. And as you're speaking, it's kind of read. I love your descriptive measure, first of all, in answering the question. I could paint image in my head as I read it along, and it seems to me like, this is gonna make a very good movie adaptation, actually, if it's ever going to be considered for one. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I bet.
That's quite it's quite an amazing one. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Yeah. So, Robert, I'd like to ask you, what authors have influenced you the most? And when did you first realize you wanted to be a writer? I think that's more like a common question writers get to be asked oftentimes.
Well, I think I first wanted seriously to be a writer was after the first time I left the United States,
Mm,
when I explained very, very briefly earlier about I was 22 at the time,
oh,
1973, and this
oh,
was after I'd returned to society from my military prison experiences. And I tried
mm,
for a while going back to school, but that didn't work out. I worked some labor jobs, but I just felt a bit alienated, a bit like a fish out of water, very different from the younger people who were only 2 or 3 years younger than I was, going to school, but their world was so different from what I had experienced. And so,
Mm.
like many of the young hippies of that time, I went on a search for identity. That's when I hitchhiked across the states and bummed around Europe. And
Wow.
the influence of all the young Europeans that I met on the road, who all seemed to have fulfilling lives, and they were all expressing themselves in one way or another through poetry or music or painting. And I they kind of led me into the direction. Actually, when I told them my story, they showed their admiration and appreciation for what I'd done, and
Mm.
that was a huge boost to my ego, I guess, or my
Yeah,
self-confidence. And so
absolutely.
when I returned to the States, I now had a target, something to shoot for. I wanted to express myself as well. And so I started studying literature, and I knew I wanted to become a writer. But first, I had to start with like a 100-meter dash runner, starting with very short stories and then working up to a marathon, up to a novel,
Mm.
which took years and years of hard work. And I studied a bit of journalism, but
Mm.
it gave me a purpose. It gave me a reason to get up in the morning. And that interest in language has stayed with me throughout my entire life. And
Wow.
eventually, uh, of course, I started reading a lot of literature at the time. I would say the writers who influenced me the most at that time were probably Hermann Hesse,
Oh,
the German writer who was actually very popular among the hippie generation. He
interesting.
wrote some books about Westerners, young Westerners searching for identity and meaning in life by taking journeys to India. And he
Mm.
he wrote a lot about Buddhism, and he was kind of a mystical character himself. Another popular writer, Jack Kerouac of the Beatnik generation, who wrote a famous book called On the Road about sort of being uh, a wild and carefree young man searching again for identity and meeting lots of
Interesting.
characters while traveling. Some of the earlier writers, John Steinbeck, I mentioned before, who wrote mainly in the 1930s, and another one, an expatriate American writer by the name of Henry Miller.
Mm.
Uh, there were several during that time that yeah, I was for some reason drawn to these expatriate writers who had left the United States and found a life abroad and were able to somehow survive through their art, through their writing.
Mm.
That appealed to me a lot.
Mm.
And then after I came to Japan, I started reading a lot of Japanese writers in English translation. And so there were several Japanese writers, the ones that off the top of my head, Dazai Osamu, Abe Kobo,
Mm.
Oe
Interesting.
Kenzaburo. I think he
Wow.
won the Nobel Prize. And
Wow.
so literature has always been a part of my life. Yeah.
Wow. That's quite amazing. I mean, it's quite fun hearing and getting to know the authors that influenced your writing, that influenced you the most. It's quite amazing, really. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of
Yeah.
good memories. Now that I'm retired, I'd like to read some of those books again. Maybe I'd have a
Interesting.
different reaction.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, apart from the books we've mentioned thus far, do you have any other works you've authored or say currently working on?
Well, I had a good, prolific period from, say, 1995 to about 2006 or seven, uh, where I wrote three novels. One was that Looking for the Summer, and then that was followed up by a couple more of semi-autobiographical novels. One was called Toraware, which is the Japanese word for obsession.
Mm.
And it's the story of three young kind of misfits, young people from different cultural backgrounds
Yeah.
in Kobe and Osaka, Japan in the 1980s, and their sort of obsessive relationship with one another. And because of different cultural upbringings and class backgrounds, a lot of misunderstandings. And in the end, they all find a different path to follow in life, and it's a kind of psychological investigation of
Mm.
alienation and obsession. And I had some really intense adventures my first 3 or 4 years in Japan, so I use a lot of my
Wow.
own experiences as material.
That's
And
amazing.
yeah, and then there was another one that's kind of a middle-aged adventure story and homage to Hermann Hesse, and another writer that I liked a lot who was claimed by Canada, spent most of his life in Canada, but he was born in England. His name was Malcolm Lowry, and he
Oh.
wrote some stories about kind of in semi stream of consciousness style about an alcoholic's
Mm.
difficulties in dealing with life in the 1930s and 40s, and again, an expatriate point of view. But it was a story based on one of his books, and
Mm.
also an experience where I took my Japanese wife one summer to Europe to kind of retrace the footsteps of when I had gone there and met the Iranian and Afghan, and had some adventures in Germany. And so I was able to show some of the key places, and actually met a couple of the key people who influenced me during my 1977 stay
Mm.
at that time. And I kind of used the same structure as one of this Malcolm Lowry's books, and I called that
Interesting.
one Autumn Shadows in August.
Oh.
And
Yeah.
then after that, my job just became too busy. That's when I was promoted to professor, and
Wow.
I was responsible for a lot of committees, and most of my job had to be done in Japanese, and I struggled a lot with
The
that. So I had to
language.
return to intense Japanese studies again. And it wasn't until my mother passed away and I was retired that I really was able to sit down and focus on a book length manuscript again.
Interesting. Wow. Thank you. So you see, I can go on and on and on and on. I love your answers to these questions. They're quite interesting to hear and quite amazing that you're sharing all of these stories with the audience on P English Literature. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for letting me do so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd also like to ask you, I know that we all have different ways of reacting to feedbacks and criticism as writers, as authors. And I'm curious to know your opinion about criticism. How would you react to negative reviews of your books, just in case you've ever had one in time past? How would you treat that particularly?
It's something every writer has to deal with, I think.
Yeah.
Once you create your baby and you set it free into the world,
Mm.
it's going to resonate with some people and not resonate with others.
The
And
people.
my earlier books, particularly Looking for the Summer, people seem to either love it or hate it. And I actually got some hate mail because of that. A lot of people who
Wow.
wouldn't recognize uh, conscientious objection. I was accused of being a traitor and a coward, and
Wow.
things of this nature. But my point of view, and on the other hand, a lot of people really thought well
Love
of
it.
it. And yeah, this was my first experience of dealing with, sending books out for book reviews and having them
Mm.
heavily criticized or praised to a certain extent. And you also have to maybe track down and find some sympathetic souls who you might ask to provide a blurb, to put on the cover, or even writing such a letter is kind of a daunting task for a wannabe writer, especially in the
Mm.
beginning. But I was able to get some people to read the book, and they provided some really good, useful criticism concerning structure. And so I was able, before sending it out again and publishing it, to
Mm.
put it through about two more rewrites, two more drafts. So through that experience and the ensuing experiences of dealing with book reviews and
Yeah,
uh, certain readers' criticism, or even emails for that matter, if you open up your world to people to contact you.
yeah,
My feeling has come to be that to be a writer, you have to have a pretty thick skin, you know. You have to be able to take criticism,
yeah,
and because it's almost inevitable, particularly if you have any kind of philosophical or political point of view
yeah.
attached to
The
any of the
book,
characters that you create or the message that you
absolutely.
try to get out there.
Yeah,
So my philosophy is actually very simple these days. If someone criticizes the work that I've done and they offer it in a constructive manner where I can learn something, then it can cause me to, I didn't think of that. In a
yeah,
sense, like a good editor would point out some
yeah.
mistakes that you need to correct. If
Mm,
that's the type of criticism, I can take that. If it's just attacking your point of view or attacking your politics or your philosophy, I just ignore it.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's as simple
That's
as that.
absolutely. I love your take on this. I love your, answers to these questions, and they're quite very relatable as well. It's something I can relate with. Yeah, because we all have different philosophy, we all have different ideas, and what Mr. A could like, another may not like it. So we have different things appealing to different people. Yeah, quite amazing to hear you talk about this. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Now, before we
Hmm.
wrap up today, I'd like to ask you, is there anything that you'd love to share with the viewers about your books, career path, and writing process that we did not mention in this interview and you'd love the viewers to know?
Uh, yeah, if it connects to potential advice,
Mm,
I'm 73 years old, so quite often when I'm speaking about writing, I'm speaking to younger people these days.
oh,
And a lot of people will ask, what have you gone through? Well, I think every writer goes through the same things.
absolutely.
It's not easy to be published, and you're going to have to uh, commit yourself to a long road. And it's easy to give up, but you can't give up. If you feel this urge, this need to express yourself in one way, whether it's through poetry or short stories or novels
Mm,
or nonfiction, memoir,
yeah,
music, art, whatever the case might be,
yeah,
you have to follow that muse and not worry about the results and what's going to happen because uh, in my experience is most of the good things that came, I could not have seen coming. They just came out of the blue. Fate,
mm,
you might call it, or good fortune,
mm,
a guardian angel, following me
yeah,
somewhere
yeah,
along,
yeah,
karma. Who knows how things work? But yeah, you just have to sit down in the chair every day for maybe an hour or so and just move the story forward, move
mm,
the poem forward. Let it sit for a while when you think you're done with it, and then come back to it later with fresh eyes. Revise. Most of
yeah,
really good writing is rewriting, and so
absolutely.
and you have to have somebody else look at it. You
Yeah,
need that criticism that we talked about a bit earlier, but from a
yeah,
trusted source
yeah.
and someone who's not just going to say to you like a family member might say, "Oh, that's great, that's great. I really like what you've done." Well, why is it great? What resonated with you? So
Absolutely.
if it's possible to, if you have the money, hire an editor.
Yeah,
If you don't, you know, uh, develop some readers. It's pretty easy these days to connect with people online. So if you join
absolutely.
a readers group or a writers group, try to get some feedback. Have
Mm,
have the courage to send it out and be humble enough to accept the advice once you get it, and
yeah.
just keep moving forward, because eventually uh, things will work out if they're meant to be. And
Mm,
in my case, I started writing in my 20s, early 20s, but I wasn't
wow.
published until I was in my late 40s. And then I
Oh.
had another 20-year period where this most recent book came out,
Mm,
and it's probably been the best book that I've written, uh, because it's a combination memoir, biography. I was able to draw upon a lot of the earlier autobiographical fiction that I wrote, and
mm,
rework a lot of that earlier material. And so, uh, yeah, don't throw away anything that you write. It might take 20 years, but you'll be able to
mm,
use it sometime or another. And just believe in yourself. It's too easy to give up. It's a long
mm,
road, and it's almost a Sisyphean task. But if the calling is there, you should follow it. And
mm,
it gives a certain meaning to life. I think it gives you a reason to get up in the morning, and you don't need to become famous or even published for that matter. If
yeah,
you find one reader that the story or the book or the poem resonates with,
yeah,
that should be your motivation right
yeah,
there, I think. But
yeah,
yeah, don't give up. Hang in there. Keep going.
yeah. I love your take on this, actually. I love your take on it. It sounds quite amazing to me. And I appreciate the fact that you've chosen to share the stories. Thank you. And now,
Yeah.
before we wrap up today, I'd like to ask you, as a published author, what sort of advice would you give writers who are still struggling with publishing a book in your particular genre? And also, where can interested readers get a copy of your book?
Well, as I mentioned there before, I think the main thing is good writing is rewriting. So, if you write something, and one thing, the process of writing itself, a lot of people seem to face what they
Mm,
call writer's block.
yeah.
And I remember Hemingway, there was a passage he wrote, I think, in his book uh, about Paris, I think, A Movable Feast, where he talked about his young days of living in Paris in the 1920s. He
Mm,
wrote that he would sit down and write, and he would never complete a scene in its entirety. He would stop halfway through. That way, that when he went back to the writing table the next morning, he would have
yeah.
a place to start, and he wouldn't be facing a blank page for the whole
Mm,
day. And so,
wow.
don't drain the well dry. Always give yourself a place to start, where you'll have a sentence or two to start the next time you sit down to write. And I found that to be really good advice, and it kept me going for a long time. Where you get halfway through a story and then you wonder, where's this story going? Where's it leading? I have no idea. But
Mm,
if you leave off at a spot where you can pick up the next day, it just seems to flow a lot more smoothly.
yeah.
So that's one thing I would do. As far as publishing these days, I think for most people, uh, the odds of being published by one of the major publishers are pretty minimal, unless you're
Mm,
really famous as an actor or singer or something. But with the internet and self-publishing, there's a whole new kind of revolution going on, and with
mm,
print on demand, and
yeah.
with you can find a lot of online distributors, or set up a situation where if you only get one or two uh, orders for a whole month or a whole year,
Mm,
you won't have a backlog of 500 copies that you have to sell that's already been published. With print on demand, it'll you can respond to each order as it comes in, or if you happen to get lucky and had 500 orders come in one day, they could fulfill those 500 orders as well. So the time we live in, technologically speaking,
Yeah.
is pretty amazing. So again, yeah, just join a writers group, get feedback from other people, keep
Mm,
writing. Don't give up.
yeah.
Uh, Look at me, I'm 73 years old. I've been able to
Oh.
publish. I didn't show the book cover, but here it is
Yeah,
again.
yeah, 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 yeah.
That's my mother on the
Beautiful.
cover, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when she was
Wow.
a teenager in high school.
That's great.
So yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
follow your passion. Follow your
Mm,
passion.
yeah, thank you. And I left a link in the discussion part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of Robert W. Norris' books directly on Amazon and also on other platforms. I also left link to his social media following for possible followers. So thank you so much, Robert, for accepting the invitation to come on the show today to talk about your amazing book, your autobiographical novel, and your other writing journey. It's quite lovely to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and I've enjoyed talking to you, and we hope to meet you again sometime. And good luck
Absolutely.
to you too in your own writing.
Thank you. Thanks a million.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna